Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's video, I'm going to be taking you through my watercolor painting process step by step for this watercolor croissant painting. I'm sorry for my French pronunciation. I know it's terrible and I'm going to be doing my best throughout the video whenever that word pops up, but yeah, I'm going to be spilling the beans on how I approach this kind of food painting or food illustration, whatever you'd like to call it. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump straight into this process. I get started with preparing 3 different colors that I'm going to be using for my croissant. And these are basically yellow ochre with some water in it. I also have some burnt sienna with a bit of yellow ochre in it. And finally, on the right of that, I also have some burnt sienna with some water in it. As you can see, these are all very juicy yet saturated color mixtures, so they have a good amount of paint and water in there. There's a good flow and movement in those color mixtures on my color mixing palette. So they are not too dry, but at the same time, they are not super watery and translucent. There's a good amount of color in them. The reason why I decided to pre-wet this entire shape before starting to drop in my color, which I am really taking my time with, by the way, I am going over everything at least 3 to 4 times, making sure that I arrive at a nice, even glistening look. No puddles are anywhere, and I've even allowed that water to settle on my paper a few seconds before starting to drop in my color. And the reason why I decided to approach painting this with pre-wetting first is not only because I knew that that water content on my paper was going to help the color expand out and kind of merge with the other colors that I would be dropping in afterwards, but also because I would have more time to develop that initial layer of different colors and values without the colors starting to dry on me too fast. Usually when we paint on dry paper, that paint starts soaking up or being absorbed into that paper pretty fast, and it starts drying pretty fast. And at this point of the painting process, I don't want to be left with hard edges around the shapes that I am painting in. And it's more helpful for me at this point that that water content helps or encourages those colors to merge together that I'm going to be placing on top. I'll be using less water and more wet on dry painting at later on points in this painting process when I am darkening darkest dark areas and also adding further detail. But at this point, I just thought it would be helpful to approach at least this shape, which is going to be the focal point of this painting, which is pretty large, by doing pre-wetting first. After I had pre-wetted the entire croissant shape, I started dropping in my lightest color that I prepared for this section of my painting, which is the yellow ochre. And I start dropping in this color in the dark areas that I'm able to see in the reference photo and try to keep some areas of lightest lights, even some areas in which the paper is shining through completely unpainted, so that I can make sure to have some lightest lights, and I'm basically starting to develop some lighter midtones. And what I always like doing is getting started with the lightest color of the bunch that I prepared for the section or area on hand, and I make my way incrementally towards the darker colors. So right now you can see how after having developed that initial layer with the yellow ochre, I am now starting to drop in the second color that I prepared for myself, which is the second darkest, which is a color mixture that is yellow ochre plus a bit of burnt sienna. And again, I am dropping this color into darker areas that I'm able to see in the reference photo, and I am making sure to drop in just a bit of color at a time, and that I am not covering up all of the previous lighter color, because it's all about developing a wide range of values and a wide range of translucencies if we're looking for something to look believable and more on the realistic side of the spectrum. The moment that we start adding way too much paint in or don't pay any attention to how saturated our paint is, we start flattening areas out. Remember that when we're painting with watercolor, it's all about using the medium's translucency to our advantage and incorporating the lightness and the brightness of the paper under the translucent paint to develop a wide range of values. And of course, it's super, super helpful to have some sort of reference photo in front of us or something in front of us in real life that we can reach out and touch that allows us to see where those different values, lights, midtones, and darks, should be developed. Because if we just start randomly placing different colors and we just start working from our imagination, oftentimes things are not going to end up looking very realistic unless you have taken time to study that specific subject before in a variety of different light situations, perspectives, etc. That's what's going to help us create a sense of 3D-ness, but it's also going to allow our watercolor pieces to glow and to look light. We want to make sure that we're keeping very light areas protected in which either the paper is shining through completely or almost completely, in which that color is kind of laid down in a very translucent state. At this point, you can see how I'm starting to drop in the darkest color, which is the burnt sienna. And I am making sure to only place it at this point in darkest value areas. Essentially, the darker I get with my color, the less amount of it I am going to place on my painting. Again, it's about adding to that variety of values and not subtracting or flattening areas out. As I am moving forward with my layering of these three colors, I'm dropping in just a bit of color at a time, and if I feel I have placed enough color on my paper, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water, removing the excess water, and I go back in to gently do those strokes in a way that will help me distribute that color out, kind of pull it out from that concentrated area, which creates a gradient going from darker into lighter values. And simultaneously, I am starting to describe the texture of that flaky bread in the croissant. So once again, you can see how I am carefully placing just a bit of color at a time. And then once I feel I have enough, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles. I go back in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and I do those strokes once again. They're gonna help me distribute that paint amongst a bigger area to dilute it even more. And at the same time, those brush strokes are helping me describe the texture of this bread. I'm noticing all of the curves created throughout the bread in that reference photo and using them to inform my decisions as to how to lay down that curved brush stroke this way and that way. And I am not being super obsessive about getting everything exactly the same way as I see it in the reference photo. I'm just using it for clues and then going from there. So at this point of the process, my watercolor paper is still pretty wet because I did that pre-wetting and because I've been adding more color on top and working on my layering. If I had not taken my time doing my pre-wetting initially, certain areas of this bread would already be dry and my colors would not be merging together, and I would probably feel the need to go in and move that paint around or soften edges or do things that at the end would make my paint look very overworked and would probably lead to splotchiness and just undesired textures. So at this point, the entire shape is still pretty wet. It's still at a point at which that paint is workable and I can still go in and drop in more color. I think it's very important that as you continue working with watercolor and doing your practice, that you start noticing those different levels of wetness that paper can have, because there always comes a point in time at which the paint starts to dry that you shouldn't be adding more color on top, because it's only going to disturb that drying process and it's probably going to lead to effects that you don't want. And so the more you practice, the better you get at just noticing when you have to just allow that layer to dry completely and then maybe come back in later to either pre-wet with clean water again or go in wet on dry, or whatever it is that you have to do to darken certain areas or add detail or whatever it is. All right, so I was pretty happy with the development of different colors and values that I was able to create in the bread, and it was time to allow everything to dry and jump on over to painting in the table or the sections of the table that are visible beneath that towel or fabric. So I decided to paint in these sections with a dark brown color, And the way that I created this dark brown color was by mixing together my burnt umber and a little tiny bit of indigo to deepen and darken it even more. So I'm using the exact same paintbrush that I was using before to paint these areas in, which is my size 6 round brush. And you can see how I even thought of creating at least somewhat of a variety of translucencies, even in these small, more secondary or even tertiary sections. Initially, I went in with this dark brown in a very translucent state, and then with that initial layer still pretty wet, I dropped in even more color in the sections of a shadow that are closest to the fabric. By going in with your color, even if you're just using one color to paint in an area, by going in with the color initially in a semi-translucent state and then dropping in more color only into areas that you want to darken further, you're able to develop, you're setting yourself up to be able to develop a larger variety of values more easily, as opposed to going in super saturated right off the bat, because that tends to lead to flatness unless you have actually planned for a specific area to be super dark and saturated. Okay, so as you can see, I am getting started with the blue sections in the fabric design, the stripes. And these I am just painting in with one color, which is indigo. I switched on over to my size 5 round brush just to be able to have a little bit more control in these very small areas. I would recommend though, if you feel more comfortable using an even smaller brush, especially for the more narrow stripes, go ahead and switch on over to an even smaller brush that you know will allow you a better water control, and also that comes to a fine tip, a fine point. Before getting started, of course, once again, I prepared a nice, juicy, and saturated color mixture just with indigo and water on my color mixing palette, and I have the exact same kind of principles in mind that I have been using throughout this entire painting process, making sure that I am going in initially with my color in a semi-translucent state. And then while that initial layer of paint in that shape is still wet, I drop in even more color within that shape in the little areas that I want to darken even further, creating a nice variety of values in each and every single shape that I am painting in. You're probably also going to notice that I leave teeny tiny little specks of paper shining through in many of these shapes, and this is because I feel that it will help me just very subtly describe the illusion of texture in that fabric, and also making sure that I am leaving little highlights here and there is also going to contribute to that overall lightness and that glow, and of course the development of my different values. So same as with what I was doing in everything else that I've painted so far, I make sure to go in with a small amount of paint, and then whenever I feel I've dropped in a good amount of paint, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush just to very, very gently, very minimally pull that color out, just help that color move out a little bit, and create nice soft transitions into lighter values. And you're also throughout this process going to see me constantly helping myself with my absorbent towel if I feel I've gone in with way too much paint, or I feel like a certain section looks too flat with one same value all throughout. I go in with either my absorbent towel to do some lifting while that paint is still wet, or I also help myself with the bristles of my paintbrush. You can use your clean paintbrush with no paint in it, of course, and you can use those bristles as a little absorbent sponge to lift up some of that paint and add more dimension into areas that you feel you've maybe flattened way too much with too much saturated color all throughout. All right, so I'm almost done here. I am going to make sure to change my water before moving on to the next phase of this painting process. And I'm also going to make sure that everything is completely dry before getting started with what I am going to do next. All right, so my entire painting is completely dry by this point. I actually used my hair dryer to speed up the drying process and ensure that everything is completely bone dry before getting started with the next layer of paint in the Croissant. I've already developed highlights, I've developed lighter midtones, I've started developing darker midtones, and at this point I want to push dark areas. So what I am preparing here for myself are two brown color mixtures. One of them is burnt sienna with a bit of water in it, and the other is burnt sienna plus some burnt umber. So that's a darker brown. And before getting started with this new layer of paint to darken dark areas I like always taking a moment to consider the values that I've developed so far throughout this area. So far, as I said, I have lightest lights, I have a wide range of midtones, and I want to make sure that I take it a step forward incrementally. I wouldn't go in with a super dark saturated brown if I have just developed very light values all throughout, because that is going to look very stark, very contrasting, and you're gonna need to work on those midtones between those two values later on if you don't take it a step forward incrementally, which is perfectly fine if you want to go in that direction, but you have to make sure that you have those transition tones, those steps in between your different values. And for me personally, it just makes sense to move forward incrementally towards darker darks. And so I like initially going in with a color that is pretty similar to the color that I previously ended that first layer with, if that makes any sense. So if I finished up that previous layer with pure burnt sienna in a wet on wet, with a wet on wet technique, I am now going to go in with the burnt sienna initially on dry paper this time, which is usually going to look darker because no longer is that paint expanding out on wet paper. It's staying concentrated in one area, which is gonna automatically, if you're using the same saturation of paint that you were using previously or a similar one, it's gonna look a step darker, even if it's the exact same color. Okay, so I am going in wet on dry this time with the last color that I was using for that first layer, which is the burnt sienna. Using that burnt sienna and my size 4 round brush, I am taking clues from my reference photo and just noticing darker value areas that I need to darken even more, respecting and just not trying to cover up lighter values, but just pushing darker value areas more. But I am going in initially and creating abstract little shapes, just taking into account the dark values that I'm seeing in the reference photo, pressing down the bristles of my paintbrush, the belly of my paintbrush in different ways to help me create abstract, very irregular shapes initially. And then while that abstract little shape with a darker brown is there, while that paint is still wet, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles, remove the excess water, sometimes by just gently touching the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel that I have right there on the left. And then I go in and kind of distribute that paint the same way that I was doing before, doing those curved brush strokes to help me expand that brown outwards, right? And that softens that brown when I expand it out. And I am using those curved brush strokes, which also helps me enhance that texture now in a more sharp kind of way, because all of this is being done on paper that is dry. As I am moving forward with this process, I am constantly testing my color mixtures out on my scrap piece of watercolor paper that I have right there, right below my painting. I want to know that I am going in with the right level of translucency, not only the right color, but also that it is not super saturated if I don't need it to be super saturated just yet. If you feel there is a very big discrepancy between the colors that you're laying down, you can always shift and change the ratios of your different colors using the browns that you already have in your color mixing palette, or creating more of the initial color mixtures that we used in the beginning. So if you feel that you need more of those super light brown values, or you want to add a little bit more texture with that very light brown, then go ahead and use the yellow ochre with some burnt sienna in it. Just notice the different values that you've already developed, and if you have to work on any transitions, if you have large gaps in between values here and there, maybe you need some sort of mid-tone work in between those, or maybe you want to add a little bit more texture with a certain brown, you can just go ahead and create a medium brown for yourself by mixing your yellow ochre and your burnt sienna, or so on and so forth, depending on what it is that you need. Just make sure that you have the development of different values in mind and that you're not flattening areas out. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how the croissant is looking at this point. I'm gonna leave it to dry. Watercolor usually dries lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave it, and I'm just gonna come back to it later to evaluate if I wanna do any more work later on. In the meantime, while that dries, I am going to work on creating very, very light gray areas throughout some sections in the fabric. Because right now I have very large flat white areas in the fabric, which of course is supposed to be white fabric with blue stripes. So what I am doing right here is I created a gray for myself by mixing together the indigo and some burnt umber. A dark blue and a dark brown are a great way of creating very dark black looking color mixtures. Now, if you remember, I painted in the table sections with the same combination of colors. It's just that with the dark brown that I created for the table, I had more burnt umber in it, so more brown in it than blue. If you want your color mixture to look gray, then you have to make sure that it has kind of a 50-50 amount of your dark blue and your brown in it for it to look gray. I recommend shifting and changing the ratios of your two colors in your color mixture, and then testing out your color mixture on your scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that it looks gray before actually starting to paint in some very light gray sections on your towel or fabric. After doing that, I made sure to go in with a very, very light translucent version of this color, so it's very watered down. Because we want to keep this towel or this fabric looking white, it's essential that you go in with a very light translucent gray, or whatever color it is that you're going to be developing your different values with. You want to go in with a very pale translucent color and add it sparingly. Make sure that you're leaving large sections of white paper completely unpainted so that the object still ends up looking white. Even though this is a white object, we want to make sure that we develop at least somewhat of a variety of different values within it very carefully, so that there is some level of realism in it and it doesn't end up looking completely flat white. Because if we leave it with completely flat white areas, there's going to be a discrepancy between the towel and the elements in which we've developed a greater level of realism. I also use this exact same gray in a very translucent state to add a little bit of a cast shadow effect right under the croissant. And after doing that, I allow that to dry and switched on over to darkening some occlusion shadow areas, wet on dry now, on the brown table beneath the fabric. So I just darkened certain little sections here and there along the edges of that fabric using the dark brown that I created by mixing together burnt umber with a bit of indigo. So the same brown that I had previously used on the sections of the table is the exact same brown that I used to further darken some occlusion shadow areas. And lastly, all I am doing right here is I am going in with a slightly more saturated dark gray color mixture and darkening certain areas, especially within the cast shadow sections right beneath the croissant, and also in the folds of the towel to just further darken certain sections within that shadow and make it look a little bit more realistic. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really, really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!